how many of you are here for the first time? Amazing. Well, I'm Don Leopold. I'm chair of environmental and forest biology. I'm privileged to be the host of this event. I want to especially thank Dale Travis and his wife, Secret from Barber. Dale graduated from ESF in 1959, although it looks like maybe 69 or 79. He felt that there was just too much significant scholarship being done at ESF that the public wasn't aware of. And so he generously funded a public lecture series. This is the 9th lecture on campus. I think it's the largest crowd we've ever had. You can read more about Dale and the program on behalf of BSF. I want to thank Dale for supporting this lecture series and for being such a loyal and generous alumnus and friend of BSF. So Dale, if you wouldn't mind just standing briefly. Let me suggest to Dale that besides this lecture series, maybe a gift for a larger lecture hall might be helpful. All right, so you're here to hear Dr. Jacqueline Frair. Dr. Jackie Frair has brought an infectious enthusiasm to our wildlife sciences students for over 10 years. She's a highly quantitative scientist that has brought this rigor into her courses and her graduate training. Students enrolled in our wildlife programs, thinking that they can avoid math, statistics, and critical thinking, quickly learn otherwise. And how many of you are in our wildlife sciences program? It's about 1/4 of the enrollment in my department. It's one of the most popular of all the majors. In 2011, Jackie received the Undergraduate Student Association's Outstanding Teacher Award, in part because of her enthusiastic delivery. I'm a little concerned. We had dinner with her tonight, and her energy levels are fairly low. I slipped her some caffeine she doesn't know about, and so just to try to perk her up a little bit. That same year, though, Jackie received the Wildlife Society's Outstanding Publication Award, and this is the hallmark of our faculty. They're incredible in the classroom, they're incredible scholars, and there's few places in the country like that. While she focused on elk for her doctoral research at the University of Alberta, she has applied her skill set to other much smaller mammals like bats and many animals in between. She's got a wonderful new project on moose. She's worked on otters. She's worked on a lot of really neat animals. And you'll hear about the Coyote project tonight. So please read about some of Jackie's accomplishments in the program. She is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Environmental and Forest Biology and Associate Director of the Roosevelt Wildlife Station here. After Jackie's presentation, if there's time, and there might not be, she'll answer questions before the reception begins at 8:30. And I think my administrative assistant back there might be contacting SU Catering to see if they can pick up some more bags of cheese doodles and other things. All right, so with Jackie, it's all yours.
Thanks, Don. Great. Well, thanks. Thanks for everybody for turning out. Coyotes are a fun topic, so I hope you get more than what you thought tonight. I'll be around for a long time to talk more. So you want to pick a fight with wolf biologists, you put up a map like this. And so it's an interesting one to start with tonight. But the idea here is that in North America, we basically have 3 different canids that we're dealing with in the Canis genus, right? We've got an eastern wolf, which is the smallish, 60-poundish wolf that we've had historically all up and down the East Coast. We have the western gray wolf, which is the larger bodied wolf that came over the Siberian land bridge. And where the fight erupts among the biologists is how fine you want to split that, if you want to cleave off the Mexican and the red and all of these other possible are they subspecies, are they full different species? So all the controversy is in what we call wolves. Coyotes have always been something other. So no matter how you want to splice up the wolf world, we've always had this coyote from the western plains and southwestern US, and every map shows that historically, just with some lots of deviations or derivations of how you split the wolves. Now, I've had the privilege of working with both the eastern wolf and the western wolf, and so I did my master's degree in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, where the eastern wolf was recolonizing that range, and Don mentioned my PhD program up in the Canadian Rockies studying elk, where wolves were the dominant predator on elk up there. And so I've had that privilege. Now, you want to talk about a species that evokes a lot of passion among the public and politicians. Wolves are a hotbed political issue. There's no way around it. And I thought I left all that shenanigans behind when I moved to New York, and here we are today. So coyotes we're just so interested in coyotes out here, and it really shocked me how interested. It took me a little while to come to the game to understand why we're so interested, and partly it's because they're new. They aren't from here, and in fact, so I left the state in 1994 to go off to grad school and other parts, and 1994, I don't think I'd ever up to that point in my life had a conversation about coyotes. They just weren't in our psyche. They weren't in our backyards, and they now are common and widespread everywhere. And that happened in about the last 25 years. They really became common. The first record was in 1925, and the last holdout was Long Island, and they are now officially on Long Island too in the last couple of years. Another reason I think that we have a tremendous amount of interest in them is there's a lot of people in the Northeast that they are interacting with. This slide is showing rural population density. So I've taken New York City and all that out of the equation here. We have the highest density of rural people interacting with this species across North America. And so it's always fun to go out west and tell everybody in Wyoming that we have more rednecks per capita than they do, right? So they don't know what they're talking about when they talk country. But another reason is these things are so highly adaptable. They are showing up everywhere. So we use the term cosmopolitan when a species has a really flexible life history. It can use a lot of stuff, right? We should call coyotes metropolitan, right? They are surviving and thriving in downtown Chicago. They are showing up on bar tops in New York City. Who saw that in the press years ago? They are showing up in elevators, the Quiznos sub shops in Chicago. They are everywhere, right? Very different species. And so that can't help but engage you. But by far the thing that captures our imagination more than anything else is the fact that when they entered New York State, they brought with them wolf genes. They're not the same Western coyote, right? And so you can see it, if I can do the pointer, let's see here, yes. And so there was two different colonization fronts. The first went up over the Great Lakes. There were still wolves up there. And the leading edge of range expansions, the animals are not common, right? And coyotes can interbreed readily with dogs and wolves, and they did. They had a hard time finding other coyotes to mate with. And so basically the wolf DNA we see in their system now is from that time period. Now there's plenty of other coyotes to breed with. And so we don't seem to have contemporary gene flow going on between them to the same degree. But they brought those genes with them when they came into New York. And then a second later wave came under the Great Lakes, and these are kind of that more Western pure type coyote. And there's been proponents that say we have this persistent mixing zone of these two colonization fronts. And where does that lie? Right down the middle of New York State. And so there's been a joke in the field for decades about this really messy genome that we're dealing with the canids, right? So we call them canis supus. And And so the most recent, and I think we've kind of come to terms now with what we're looking at, that Monzon and all down at SUNY Stony Brook, they took samples, all of the ones in New York are from our study, they took samples all across this range, all the way out to Ohio, what they call the contact zone, what they consider this northeastern coyote that's different, and they compared them against western wolves, against pure eastern wolves, against western coyotes, and they all fell right in this mass. They expected to see basically 3 different groups, and they just saw one big mass. So we have one species across this entire range. And in fact, they are arguing that this is a separate species now. And it boils down to these animals have about 60% western coyote in their genome, 30% eastern wolf, and about 10% domestic dog. I think I'm safe saying this. I think the community's come to consensus that this is what the geneticists really believe we're looking at out here. And they are arguing that, so they are mostly coyote. So on this physical space, they're over near the western coyotes. But they are distinct enough that people are arguing now that we should be considering them their own species, perhaps. And so they've suggested this Canis oriens, or basically the eastern canid. And the fact that they have wolf genes alone is enough to spark our imagination, right, as to what they might then do in this landscape, right? These big predator species that we haven't dealt with before, they fill in the vacant niche of the wolf. They are larger than their western counterparts, but I want to put that in perspective. So I pulled this graphic off the web the other day. I thought it was very cute. It has the western coyote at about 27 pounds on average. The eastern coyote, or coy wolf, as people like to call them, they're about 12 to 15% larger. So it's only about 8 pounds different. So basically take your house cat and add it to a normal coyote, and that's what we have in the east, right? Which is still a heck of a lot smaller than the eastern wolf, which is the little wolf, remember. And so it's still about 20-some pounds smaller than the eastern wolf. And I always add the German Shepherd in for comparison, because we got to put this into our own, the way we can see these things, right? And so the average German Shepherd is about 70 pounds. The average eastern coyote is half that in size. And yet we think they are enormous, right? And so it's just important to put that in perspective. And so this is Numi Mitchell. She's a biologist over in Massachusetts. And so she's not a large person, and this is a pretty average coyote that she's holding right there. Now, wild animals look enormous. They are bushy, and the one thing they are is tall. And that they look different than our dogs in the house. And so we tend to have this perspective that they're bigger. Now, I'm not saying that some of the coyotes don't get up to 50 pounds plus pounds. So trappers absolutely are catching coyotes that big. But on average, they're coming in right at about that 35, 36 pound mark. So in my lab, we've been a lot less interested in what they are, and a lot more interested in what are they doing. What is their functional role in this system? So this is a new species in our system. That has to have interesting consequences, right? So we know their diets have been dominated by deer. So there have been speculations that they have become deer specialists. And that's one way that they're differentiating from western coyotes. So we question this. We want to look at the data, see what we can find out. We also want to then know, what is the predation rate on deer, and understand the implications for deer herds. And I can guarantee you, I could probably divide this room in half of the people that really hope coyotes will control deer numbers and knock them down, and the other half says they're decimating deer herds and we need to get rid of coyotes. And I guarantee that internal dynamic is going on. And then we have another question, separate from that, about how are native carnivores dealing with this new predator, right? What are their mechanisms for coexistence? So I did not do this alone, and I need to right up front point out all of my graduate students, postdocs, a ton of collaborators at different organizations, and literally hundreds of students and volunteers that have come out and helped us on this project over the years. So I wanted to make sure they get credit up front, even though I'm the one standing up here, and I'll forget to mention them again. So make sure they get their credit. So first of all, let's take a look at this evolving diet. So we're going to zoom in here to ESF's Huntington Wildlife Forest, which is right in Newcomb in the central Adirondacks, where we've had a picture of coyote diets since the 50s. So my predecessor, Bob Chambers, he was dying for a coyote study, and he had already retired when I started here, and I started this coyote grant, and he showed up at my door the next day, and all the old information came out, and so we had tons of stuff to compare. And so when coyotes first came in the state and we started paying attention to them, we look at their diets and they were just kind of what you'd expect across the range of western coyotes. They were dominated by snowshoe hare. Deer were important, beaver showing up a little bit. But boy, by the 70s, deer absolutely dominated their diets. And if you follow this bar over, by golly, that's just about 100%. And what we're looking at is the number of scats that showed up, that these prey individuals showed up in those scats, right? And so 100% of the scats in the woods in the winter had deer hair in it in the 80s. And so the first thing I did when I came in was had a student redo this study, exactly following the protocol, walking in the same places they walked, making the same judgment calls, and we found quite a reduction in the amount of deer showing up in the Adirondacks and a concurrent increase in the amount of beaver. And in fact, you can kind of see beaver stepping up over time, and this is a point we're going to come back to in a second. So sorry, I thought I was on to the next slide. So importantly, when we look at the hair in the scats, we can tell from the cuticular scale patterns that are on them whether or not it's a fawn or it's an adult up to about August in the summer. And so we can get a feeling for, whereas we don't know if adult deer, especially in the winter, we don't know if they were scavenged or actually killed, we can make a fair good assumption that the fawns that we're seeing in there were killed by those coyotes. And so fawn use over these two periods was identical, or pretty much identical. And I put this little star up because one thing we do when we look at scats to understand how much food these animals are taking in, we have to do a biomass correction. So big animals have a lot more food relative to hair, right? So a lot less comes out in scats than like a mouse, and so they get over and underrepresented, and so we have to adjust for body mass. And when we do that biomass adjustment, then we can see that beaver, for the first time in this time series, is providing basically more protein to coyotes in the summer than deer are in the Adirondacks. And so if we think coyotes have become deer specialists, well, you would expect that as deer numbers go up, the amount of deer in coyote scats should go up, right? They should be tracking their primary prey. And what tends to drive deer numbers in the Adirondacks is winter severity. It's ignoring me for a second. Hey, it's ignoring me. Okay, I'm going to do this. All right. And so this particular drop is really notable, obviously, on this graph, right? And that coincided with a series of very extreme severe winters combined with really liberal hunting seasons, right? So that big number drop happened there. And in fact, winter severity is the number one predictor of the deer dynamics up in northern ungulate herds, and the Adirondacks is no different. In comparison, then, the amount of deer showing up in coyote diets does not reflect deer abundance at all. And in fact, let's see if this still works. So in fact, this time period where they really jumped up in use probably had a lot to do with a lot of sick and dying deer in the landscape. They were easy pickings, right? But then they figured it out, and they still have this high use, very interestingly, across a time period when we saw really rapid increase in recovery in deer numbers. But now deer have stabilized at this new lower carrying capacity, and the foresters tell me that a lot of this has to do with we've now had this Adirondack wild forest that has grown up and matured. We've got closed canopy forests, and we don't have as much food in the understory. So carrying capacity for deer has lowered largely from that. But predation absolutely can be playing a role in setting a lower carrying capacity and in the dynamics of these northern deer herds. And what they really do seem to be tracking, and this is the case across northern ranges for coyotes, snowshoe hare have predominantly been their primary prey. And we've seen a long-term decline in snowshoe hare statewide and across the Adirondacks. And so early on, this first study right here is when hare dominated their diets. They switched over to deer when hare numbers started really declining, and then more recently they're switching on to beaver as beaver have really recovered. In the 1900s we'd gotten down to one single pair of beaver in the Adirondacks, and so it took a little while for them to come back and get back up here, and it's taken a little while for coyotes to figure it out, and now they're really keen into those beaver. And we've actually seen that happen. The wolves in Algonquin have tracked the beaver recovery. We see their use ticking up. Wolf-coyote hybrids in Ontario and coyotes in Quebec as well. So I'm interested then in comparing that across the state. So that's this northern system with deep snows where we really expect predation to be an important factor in deer herds, right? Well, what about the rest of the state? What's it look like? So if we look at from north to central to western New York, we have an increasing deer density. And so we physically went out and measured deer density. And then we have also what the DEC records in terms of the harvest that also reflects it. So we have this increasing trend in deer numbers. So again, we'd expect we should see more deer in the diet where deer are more prevalent, and that is not what we see. We see either across the summer pretty consistent use. This is the percent biomass in their diets. Consistent use here, and even declining use as deer is getting higher density in western New York. And to me, especially because this is winter, this makes a lot of sense, because if we have winters like we had this year, deer are not that easy for coyotes to get. Now, I am not the kind of person that will tell you that deer only take the sick and the young, or coyotes only take the sick and the young. Predators will take whatever they want. And given the right conditions and sufficient motivation, they can take down anything. And even those little western coyotes take down adult-sized elk. There is evidence of eastern coyotes taking down full-sized, healthy moose. And so they, just because they can do it, the question is how much and how important is that? And my guess is that in western New York, when the deer when there's no snow really influencing them, the deer are hard to get. So now let's look at this alternative prey across the state. So now we're looking at 95% of the biomass they consume in the summer. And in the Adirondacks, it's just deer and beaver. That's 95% of their diets. In the rest of the state, it's a whole bunch of other stuff. There isn't one single species that is really that key prey species that coyotes are keen in on. And I highlight livestock in both of these because they show up in the top three in both seasons. And during the course of our study, we kept in really close contact with all of the landowners, and there were no livestock depredations during this time period. So this was all scavenged, which means there's a lot of food subsidy in the landscape, if you will, that can keep populations elevated even when native prey might be scarce, right? So that can be an issue for how coyotes might be influencing other populations. Here's the problem. So when you only look at what something eats, you don't know how they acquired it. And that's where all the action is in predation, right? So just because 100% of the scats had deer hair in it, it doesn't mean they killed the animals, right? So this is what I spend a lot of time with my students piecing apart and trying to understand, right? A couple of things we need to know. One, we need to know, well, how many coyotes are there? And then what's the average coyote impact, right? So what is basically the number of deer killed by an individual coyote in a given unit of time, and multiply that by how many coyotes we have, and then we start getting a picture for how big predation pressure is. On top of that, we need to know who gets killed. And so northern deer herds, ungulates in particular, or ungulates just in general, their population growth rates are most sensitive to survival of breeding adult females. And evolutionarily, deer have evolved to have very little change, very high female survival rates, and not a lot of wiggle room, not a lot of variance in that. And so a slight change and decrease in their survival rate can have a really big impact in population growth rates. And by contrast, fawns die from a lot of stuff. And so there is a really high variance and a lot of mortality going on with fawns. And so a big change in fawn survival may have a relatively little change on population growth rates. And so we need to know who's getting killed and how much are they getting killed. And then we need to know whether or not mortality is compensatory or additive. And that is focused on compensatory mortality is the concept that there's this doomed surplus. They're going to die even without, if you took coyotes off the landscape, you have the same survival with and without them, right? Or it's fully additive in that all the other sources of mortality happen and then coyote predation comes in and gets added on top of all of that independently, right? We're never at either end of this spectrum, always somewhere in between. And we're looking for lines of evidence to figure out where are we? Are we more towards the additive or the compensatory? Because it really has a big difference in how we manage populations. And compensatory mortality, in fact, undermines the success of predator control programs all across the country. All right, so one of the first things my grad students did was try to figure out how to estimate coyotes. Now, this is a deceptively simple task just go out and count them, right? Like, how hard could it be? Well, estimating animal abundance with precision and without bias is probably the most daunting task we have in wildlife. And part of that reason is because we only see a fraction of the animals, and our probability of being able to see them, the detection probability, is not constant over time or space. And so we have to really account for that, or we can't even compare two counts between areas. And so what we did was we capitalized on the fact that these guys like to sing out loud. And so with wolves and coyotes, since the 40s, we would set off sirens or use an electronic collar or howl ourselves and elicit a response from them and just use those raw counts as relative indices of abundance. And we wanted to make that a real estimate of abundance by accounting for detection. A couple of problems we had was the territory holders, those that are actually protecting space, are about 4 times more likely to respond than transients. And so we know we're only getting, more so we're getting the resident territorial population. So we're setting our inference to that. And also, counts greater than 3 are unreliable. So here's my challenge to you. The next time you're in a zoo that has a pair of coyotes, close your eyes and get them howling and try to count them. So there will be 2 in there, and you'll hear the first one go, you'll hear the second one go, and then their harmonics sound like 7, and you're surrounded by them, and you cannot tell them apart. That's my challenge to you. So we used a technique called Q counts, where we know it's the resident territory holders answering us. And so if we heard anything howl from 1 to 7, we said we have a breeding pair. Right? So our estimates were for the number of breeding pairs in the landscape, and that really is what anchors coyote density, is how many territories is in an area. We also know that only about 50% of the time when we call them and they hear us do they bother responding, right? And we know that from places like Yellowstone, where you can sit up and look over at the roaring hills and you can physically watch these wide open spaces and see if they answer you or not, right? So that's just a constant we have to correct by. And this is where all the action was, and the fact that even if they answer us, we aren't always going to be able to hear them, and that depends on a lot of conditions, and I'll talk about in a second. Not the least of which is that coyotes can hear us further than we can hear them. So they may be 5 kilometers out and answering us, and we can only hear them if they're within 2 kilometers, right? So what my grad student did was she modeled sound spread just based on the first principles. Sound slows down and decays really quickly over space, right? That it's dampened by intervening vegetation and bounced off of terrain, these kinds of things. So she came up with a standalone, spatially explicit, this is a quantitative terms my students hate, probability of detecting. So here we go. If a coyote howls in the woods, so you can go anywhere in the state of New York and I can tell you if a coyote howls within 2 kilometers of you, the probability that you're going to hear it at that point, right? And the take-home point of this to start with is if you live up here in the St. Lawrence region or out here in the Lake Plains, I'm betting you think you are surrounded by coyotes because sound really spreads well and you're going to hear all of them. You're down here in the Catskills and they may be equally as abundant, but you don't hear them. So your perception of how many are out there would be very different just because of how sound spreads across the space. And so we went out and did a statewide howling survey to correct our counts, and just based on the fact that we're less likely to hear animals farther away from us, we estimated this fixed probability of detection of about 19% of the time when they call, we're likely to hear them, right? And that gives us, when we break down densities in 5 different ecoregions, the different colors here, that's what you're looking at here. But that's biased, so don't write that down. So when you account for the spatial variation in how call and sound spreads, then we get a much more robust picture. So we have much tighter confidence intervals, and this bias is removed from assuming that we can equally hear them across space. So really what we've got throughout the entirety of the Allegheny Plateau, the St. Lawrence and Mohawk River valleys, and the Adirondacks is about 1 pair of coyotes per 10 kilometers squared. That's about the max density we get. And then it's a little bit lower in the Lake Plains region, so this area where you can hear them a lot, they actually have lower density than the area where you can't hear them as well. And then the Hudson Valley somewhere in between. So the beauty of what this gave us was a really efficient tool for quantifying numbers. So now we can go out and reliably count numbers and compare that over time and space. And so if we're going to do management intervention and we're going to decrease coyote numbers, now at least we can tell whether we even did that effectively to begin with, right? We didn't have that tool before. And so now we get into the second piece of the equation and looking at the predation rate on deer. And we have these two study areas, central New York and Worcester, that's near Oneonta, and then out here in western New York and Bath. We picked these two sites because the amount of forest and the amount of ag was pretty similar between them. The terrain conditions were pretty similar, but they just gave us different landscapes to work in without major changes in landscape structure. All right, so my question to you, what killed this deer? There's only one right answer here. I don't know. Nobody knows, in fact. But this is what we come across in the woods, and we're coming across this a lot more because they're scavenging and things are getting spread out, right? The problem is you have to be there within, 24 hours ideally, 3 days at the most, to be able to have enough evidence still left on the carcass that you can tell whether or not a predator killed it or something else killed it, right? We're looking for things like blood trail in the snow, like hemorrhaging inside from the trauma of being bit and pulled and scratched and pulled down. We want to see bite marks, and especially in certain places, and then we can measure those bite marks relative to coyote skull, right? This is the kind of evidence we need, and there are so many scavengers in the landscape. Like how many have shot a deer and lost it overnight because of coyotes or other species that are out there. So we need to get there quick, and so we achieve that using GPS collars. So it's the same kind of GPS device that's in your car and in your phone, just costs a lot more. And so this little baby, about $2,500 a piece for these collars, and they had two-way communication, so we could dial into the collars and tell it for the next 3 days, get a location on that animal every 20 minutes. And then at the end of the 3 days, we could tell it to stop, save battery power, because it drains the juice so fast. And so then we would download those data and get right on the heels of that animal. And that's how we were able to be there really quickly. Because in out west, we can do this through snow tracking. We don't have reliable snow conditions in New York for that. So we had to go high tech. So here's what we found. So in winter, after 2 winters, we had 11 different coyotes collared. We managed to get to about 44% of the locations that the coyotes visited over that time period, which was about 1,800 sites. We found 86 carcasses of large mammals that they had at least stopped and checked out. 24 of those, about 28%, were scavenged livestock. And so even though stockpiling livestock carcasses, it's not technically a legal activity, but it is a practical activity, and so it is done. And I can tell you right now, coyotes will show you where every single one of these is if you're interested, because they know, and they revisit them a lot. We found 62 deer carcasses, and of those, they were fresh enough, cause of mortality, we were able to get very clearly on 39 of those deer. And here was the interesting story. 92% of those were scavenged, and only 8% were killed. So only 3 were killed. And we really vetted this because we did not want to misclassify a predation as a scavenge. And so we talked with the landowners. And so when there was anything in doubt, we would talk to the landowners and find out, oh, yep, that deer had been hit by a car, and I dragged it in the woods the other day, right? I'm pretty sure this bag of deer legs was not killed by the coyotes, that kind of thing. Here's where it gets interesting. So this is where we start looking for compensatory versus additive mortality. These 3 animals all had serious pre-existing leg injuries that would make them basically the walking dead, right? So if you're thinking of how much predation is going to have an effect on this population, not so much, obviously, in this particular case. Now, these were 2 winters that I hate to even say normal, because do we have normal winters here anymore? They were not deep snows. They were not super mild. They were just kind of your average southern tier winter. And during this time, we know coyotes did kill a healthy adult deer. So it's not that they weren't doing it, it's just that it's happening a lot less than we might think it is, at least from what we saw here. So let's put it in context then of other studies. So these are previous studies in the north, including the Adirondack region, where up in I know this is a terrible photo, but it's a NOAA from snow depth in February 2014 that shows basically right about here, we're up in deep snow zone, where you can really expect predation to have a bigger effect. And indeed, throughout here, coyote deer studies are showing active predation on adult deer and additive sources of mortality and even quite high levels of predation. And we even saw that in the Adirondacks in the 90s. And what we can add to that is we do see coyotes switching over towards beaver now. Now the implications for what that might mean for deer, maybe it will draw predation away from deer, maybe it will buoy the number of coyotes and elevate predation on deer through spillover effects. So time will tell on what that actually bears out in the northern. But out here where we have less snow and the deer aren't as accessible, we saw largely incidental, I would call it, predation and compensatory mortality through the adult component. But we know coyotes kill fawns, right? There's no doubt about it. And but we didn't think we'd really have that much of a chance with these GPS collars to pick it up because we figured it doesn't take very long to scoop one of these fawns up and disappear it, right? But it actually worked really well with the GPS collars. So over the course of 2 summers, we found 56 kills of mid-sized prey. And in fact, those undergrads were searching so hard. Look they found mice. They found evidence of mice killed by coyotes. They were searching so hard, so God bless them. All right, so we found 33 fawn kills, 13 woodchuck kills, and 10 turkey kills. And interestingly, we found some pretty interesting specialization among the coyotes on this, a point I will come back to in a minute. So to try and then to take that and estimate a kill rate for fawns requires a bit more work, and it requires math, and I'm not going to put up the math, I'm going to put math up in pictures here and see if you can work with me on this. So basically what we were looking for was the signature in the GPS, so these are all GPS locations that we collected on different coyotes, each color is a different coyote, and we are looking for the signature of a fawn kill in there, right? We know from the sample of fawn kills that we had that when they have a kill, they spend about an hour processing it. So that's about 2 to 3 20-minute GPS locations, right? And that they do this in a concentrated radius, right? So now we want 3 locations that aren't further than 50 meters apart, right? So we ran this through basically a disease hotspot clustering technique that helped us reduce those 17,000 original GPS fixed points to about 1,000 clusters where coyotes spent time based on that criterion. We went out and had field verified almost 600 of them, of which there are 51 kills and 544 non-kills. And then we look at what site covariates, time of day, time of year can help discriminate whether or not one of these clusters is a kill or not kill. That's not my phone, I don't think. So one thing we saw was a really steep decline across the course of the summer, and that's not surprising. That's pretty common with predation on fawns. The other thing was male coyotes were doing the killing. So a cluster that left by a male coyote is going to be twice as likely to be a fawn kill as one that by a female. The killing is happening at night, so there's a risky time period. It's 7.5 times more risky at night. And unplowed fields and wetlands were the risky habitat types for fawns. Now, we can take that and put that into a crude fawn kill rate, which is shown here. So we're looking at basically the mean kills per coyote per day through the fawning season. And a few take-home points here. One, here's those males doing more killing than the females, right? So if we have 2 coyotes in a pair, it isn't twice the kill rate, right? There's some sharing going on here. Also, you see there's tremendous confidence intervals on these estimates. And that's that. I told you I saw some specialization before. So we had many coyotes that didn't kill fawns at all, or at least we didn't detect them killing fawns. We had some that were really proficient at turkey killing. We saw some that were completely keyed in on woodchuck, right? And yes, we had the few that were really good at killing fawns. And so that's what's causing this variance. And so if you want to know what the average coyote is doing, you're kind of out of luck because it really varies from backyard to backyard and who's out there. The third thing to note is that by July 1st, we just saw it just dropped right off. We don't see fawn kills happening very much after that, and that's right about the time where fawns get big enough to jump up and run away from coyotes, right? So predation seems to drop. And the important thing here is deer have evolved a predator swamping strategy to make sure that fawns make it through this period. And so they all breed at the same time in the spring, they all drop their fawns, and they're all vulnerable at the same time in the fall. Predators only have so much time in the day and so much stomach that they can fit fawns into, right? So they're handling limited and time limited. And that's what helps ensure that, that fawns make it through and deer persist under high predation. Because remember, coyotes aren't the only thing out there eating those fawns too. We've documented very clearly deer are incredibly important to coyotes in this study. Trying to now turn it around and say how important is coyote predation to deer is a whole different study. This definitely has to come at it from the perspective of the deer and deer survival rates, because, as I said, we've got expanding black bear populations. Now, across black bear range, they are the #1 fawn predator, right? And so coyotes give them a run for their money, and so now we've got places where the two of them are overlapping, and that could be interesting dynamics. But again, through the fawn component, they can absorb a lot of mortality without having big impacts on populations. And there's a lot of studies through the southeastern U.S. that have been looking at coyote control. And so even where you can control and reduce numbers of coyotes effectively, the effect on fawns is kind of 50-50. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because you're not sure of that local circumstance about whether alternative prey, conditions, whether you've got the coyotes that are queuing in on fawns. And so coyote control on its own has been deemed less effective in terms of management actions. People are really focused now on habitat management to give those fawns the right escape cover and hiding cover to get through the fawning season more effectively. All right, so the last bit I want to talk about is competition with native predators. I guess I will say one more thing is that people are doing fawn survival studies. And so right now in Fort Drum, there is a study of fawn survival that's exactly following on these studies and looking at what are the major predators, what are the major factors that we can do to improve fawn survival. The other piece is that there's been efforts to try to figure out what can we do as managers of herds. What are our mechanisms we have to be able to keep the deer herd where we want it in light of this predator in the landscape. And so some modeling efforts have shown that just through adjustment of how many does you harvest in a population, because doe harvest tends to be additive mortality, and so a small change in doe harvest seems to be enough to absorb the effects of coyote predation and keep herds where we want them. All right, so the last bit I want to talk about is it's coyote effects on our native suite of predators. And so we're looking at competition both on Fort Drum as well as in that central Adirondack area. So the law of competitive exclusion is an easy one to understand. No two species in the same niche going after the same resource are going to do that for very long, right? You have to differentiate. And so we can expect them to start partitioning either food, partitioning space, or using the same resources in space but at different times, right? So there has to be some kind of partitioning, and that can and how that plays out can have big implications for the numbers of these animals and for how we manage them and what we might expect. So what we did was we looked at we wanted to look first at diets to look at resource partitioning. Now here's an interesting thing. So before I was looking at the diet all through the scats, which works really well for coyotes. We have, on Fort Drum, we picked up all the predator scats. We said, this is fox, this is coyote. Then we genetically tested them all. Everything we said was coyote was coyote. Everything we said was red fox was coyote. And so when you start doing multiple species and they overlap in size classes, it gets a little tricky, right? And it gets really expensive when you start having to add genetics into it. And so instead, we put up, in the Adirondacks, we went to trappers and got hair samples from species. And in Fort Drum, we put up hair snares and picked up hair samples. And you can look at the stable isotopes in the hair and the principle you are what you eat, and you can start getting a feeling based on the isotopic composition of the hair of what the diet is. And so here's the hypotheses we were looking at, that so this nitrogen isotope really tells trophic position. So herbivores are going to be on the bottom, carnivores are going to be on the top. all of these guys we kind of expect to be about in the middle together, but there is a hypothesis, and it came out of human population literature showing that populations that have a higher proportion of meat in the diet versus those that have a higher proportion of vegetation in the diet tend to be higher on the scale. So we thought that maybe bobcats, the only obligate carnivore of the group, the one who can't synthesize taurine, so they have to eat organ meat. All the others could be pure vegetarian if they so chose, and they eat a lot of vegetation. We thought they might partition along that line, but we mostly expected them to partition across the carbon isotope, and the carbon isotope represents vegetative signature. So this is basically the food that's eaten by what these guys are eating, right? And so, or eating garbage. And the point is that the carbon isotope gets pulled out in this direction when animals have access to corn, because it's the only C4 plant that these animals might have access to. And so all of this, what don't we have corn in our food, right? And so birdseed and all of our garbage is full of corn. And so there's been a great set of literature looking at problem black bears and trying to identify the problem black bears. And on this axis, if you look at their carbon isotopes, all the problem bears are over here because they're accessing human food, right? And so we looked at it with to look at this space to see how they might be tolerant to humans and access to food, and we expected red fox to be out here. So again, we looked at it in two very different landscapes, the Adirondacks and Fort Drum, and we see indeed the foxes are on the farthest end of that carbon axis, bobcats over here, coyotes right in the middle. And a couple of interesting points here. One is that there's more overlap in the diets between gray fox and coyote in the Adirondacks. Possibly there's more trees, and coyotes or gray fox can climb trees and escape, and maybe one mechanism that they can afford more overlap spatially. On Fort Drum, tighter conditions, we see a lot less overlap, and so the foxes are doing something more discrete from coyotes. But what I think is really interesting is the fact that coyotes are right in the middle. And so are they pushing our native carnivores to extremes, pushing them into urban habitats? And in fact, since I've been in the state, everybody's been telling me that they're seeing red fox. Not everybody, that's a great exaggeration. But I'm hearing a lot that foxes are taking up residence under people's backyard or under their decks, and they're in and around school. And this is why we're studying this on Fort Drum to begin with, because red foxes are in and around the schoolyard, and we want to know, are they a problem for people? And so there is evidence, this is a study from Chris Rota, and this is from the southeastern U.S., that shows that each of these animals changes its response to human-dominated landscapes when they share the landscape with coyotes than when coyotes are absent. And the net effect they predict is that you're going to have more foxes in human-dominated landscapes where coyotes occur. And so we're looking at that at Fort Drum. We have camera traps out all over Fort Drum. This is the impact area with live ordnance, so nobody goes in there. That's why there's no cameras there. This is what they call the cantonment area. That's where all the concentrated residences and commercial and all the high-density roads, which is a very, very, very busy place right here. This is pretty wild space. And what you're looking at from the green is shown, so the black dots are the traps, and the green, size of the green shows coyote activity, basically how many times we caught coyotes on camera at that spot. So pretty uniform, no big pattern to how they're displayed or how they're showing up. Look at gray fox. They are in people's backyards, hands down. And red fox as well. The problem with red fox was, this started out as a coyote red fox study. In the first year, we had lots of red fox, and then a mange epidemic came through and wiped them out. And they didn't even show up hardly at all the second year. But the gray fox are showing an interesting pattern. And the single predictor of gray fox habitat use, the strongest predictor, is the density of culverts. And if you search, like I did for this particular talk, gray fox or red fox and culverts, you will see a whole bunch of pictures with little cute fox puppies sticking their heads out of culverts. And so my guess is that they really are finding some refugia, not necessarily from people per se, that coyotes aren't avoiding where the people are, but we're creating something in structure that the foxes can really benefit from that the coyotes aren't using, right? So they're partitioning the landscape based on human patterns, which is pretty interesting. And this is my last slide, just a little teaser. Back to stable isotopes, looking at the entire carnivore community in the Adirondacks, and we saw one surprise to us is how much fisher overlapped coyote. So fisher are a big weasel, this guy down here. They compete with marten. That's where all the story is. Fisher and marten, we all know they compete. But this surprised us, and in fact, fisher across their northern range have been in decline, a long-term decline, and nobody has yet taken a look at, well, do coyotes play a role in that? So I'm thinking that might be my next study right there. All right. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm happy to take questions. I want to thank Dale Travis and all of the people who helped out on the study. And if you want more information, basically everything I talked about I publish on my website, and so you can find it there. Thank you for your attention.
So given the size of the crowd, how uncomfortable it is in here, and because one of the local TV stations wants to do an interview with Jackie, we're not going to have questions. I will give out her email address. You can all email her. Or maybe not for real or a starting point. So, a couple things I do need to do is we have been trying to do something special for the speakers because they do an awful lot for ESF, and this is just one more thing they do on top of everything else. And so I have a local artisan make a hand-carved bowl for each of the speakers, and I have that over here. So now Jackie is the 9th speaker to receive a beautiful bowl. This one happens to be cherry. I think this one is the prettiest of the 9, other than the one that Dale has. And it's from Thomas Horrigan, who's a local woodworker. And it's just a gorgeous bowl. So Jackie, come on up. I'd like to give this to you. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
So I believe that the new station come up here to the corner, so give Jackie some breathing room. But before we do that, I want to announce that on April 22nd, the college is having a huge Earth Day event on this campus Saturday. And it's also the March for Science in DC. I can tell you that the event here is going to be more exciting. And we're even going to erect a small version of the Washington Monument. So if you're here that day or if you're in town, think about coming up. There's going to be some great presentations. You'll learn more about what others in other departments are doing. And there's so much neat stuff going on up here. That's April 22nd. It'll be in the afternoon on Earth Day. So with that, I invite you out to the reception, and if you get something to eat and drink, maybe come back in here and mill about so others can. Thank you very much for coming.